Today, we are voting on something hugely consequential, a new net zero target that will allow ministers and civil servants to control almost every part of the economy and the cost of goods in every aspect of people's lives. It will affect the cost of energy, food, housing, heating, transport, holidays and shipping. Which industries will find it competitive to do business in Britain and which industries won't? And yet, in this chamber, can anybody put a figure on how much more expensive this will make food, or energy bills, or family holidays? I'd happily give away, I'd happily for them to cite the figure.
Offshore wind power has insulated British consumers against the fossil fuel price hikes that we've seen as a consequence of the Iran war, and that is evidence that investment in renewable energy is good for consumers and businesses.
Well, first, I will note that the honourable gentleman didn't answer my question, and that's because he doesn't have an answer. So let me answer his. On an electricity bill, 25% of the cost is a wholesale cost. 75% is a non-commodity cost. The reason that bills have gone up so much is partly because of the taxes and levies and policies that his government has chosen. The vast majority of this cost, I'll just pursue some of my argument on this. The vast majority of the cost on the electricity bill is not to do with wholesale prices. And actually, the question that I had asked him is if he could tell us, and he should listen to this, he's not even listening to the point. If he can tell us the legislation that he is voting on today, what it will do to the price of food for his constituents, the price of energy for his constituents, the price of holidays for his constituents. Well, excuse me, let me just make this point. Let's try this question. How many people here can say, hand on heart, they have read the impact assessment for this legislation? In which case, the gentleman says that he has. Could he cite the number of overall jobs it will create or lose in the overall economy? I would happily give way. The number of jobs.
I thank the Shadow Secretary for giving way. Her argument would have a lot more credibility if she had not said in 2023, nothing will distract us from achieving net zero or driving forward renewables. I want people to feel nothing but unadulterated optimism. We are absolutely committed to our target. The facts about climate change have not changed, yet she has changed her mind. Could it be because of the people sitting on the benches over there?
Well, I thank the honourable gentleman for his intervention, but he also did not answer my question on jobs. And let me say this. I inherited my party's position on net zero. I made it very clear from the outset that my priority was affordability for Brits in this country and that net zero should not impoverish consumers. In fact, I made some changes which meant that the party opposite called me a climate denier and a flat earther. And now he comes to this chamber not to scrutinise the legislation that will have a massive effect on his constituents, but to criticise me for scrutinising the legislation, asking questions and changing my party's position. I am very proud to have changed my party's position because I care about the consumer, I care about jobs, I care about the price of food and the price of energy. None of the people on the benches opposite seem to do so, because if they had, and I'll make some progress, because nobody is actually answering these questions, if they actually cared about these things, they would have read the government's impact assessment. Not anybody of them seemed to. Well, they couldn't answer the question on jobs, because the government's own impact assessment admits the government's own impact assessment, and he would know this if he'd read it, it admits that its modelling does not actually consider any upside or downside risks to the economy arising from the energy transition, and it specifically says it doesn't consider the impact on jobs. So that means they are voting on legislation today without any idea of what it's going to mean for the British worker. And again, the impact assessment is clear, it's explicit. The modelling does not analyse energy security. So they do not know what this will mean for the energy security of our nation. So when the head of the Unite Union said at the weekend that the Secretary of State only seems to be interested in one side of the equation, rushing Britain to net zero with almost no thought for jobs or national security, she was spot on. It has literally not been properly assessed. And what's worse is that the MPs opposite want to make their political points, but none of them seem to care. And considering how much people are struggling and how much growth is flatlining, are members on the benches opposite really happy to wave through these legal targets without the foggiest idea of what it will do to the economy, what it will do to the cost of living, or what it will do to energy security? If the honourable gentleman would like to tell us about the impact on jobs, he's more than welcome to do so.
Aware of the evidence from the Climate Change Committee that says that the cost of doing nothing is more expensive than the cost of everything that is needed to do for net zero. So when she sits there and attempts to stand in the way of this, what she is actually doing is attempting to pile up the costs on British business, on British consumers, and on the sustainability of our country. She should be the one that understands the impact of her policies, rather than attempting to row back on one of the very few things that the previous government should have been proud of.
I will come to the evidence of the Climate Change Committee in a second. But what I will note again, once again, a member of the party opposite cannot cite an overall figure on jobs. You would think that the Labour Party would be able to cite a figure on jobs. Look, I've tried a number of you, and nobody has an answer. So let me put this to them. OK, I'll tell you what. Is it going to be about jobs? Please, go ahead.
It will be about jobs. I thank her for giving way. The CBI, not the government, but the CBI, have found that the net zero economy is worth £100 billion of investment in this country every year, and worth 1.1 million jobs.
Yep. 1.1 million. Oh dear. So the honourable gentleman hasn't read that report either, because what they include in those jobs is waste, recycling and nuclear power. Does he think that they didn't have those jobs before the net zero target? They also include soil restoration and land management. They specifically say, I'm sorry, they don't seem to like this, but I've actually read these reports. They don't seem to realise that report includes a huge range of things that has nothing to do with the net zero target. So once again, let me press on. Now, when the Climate Change Committee produces advice to the government about what carbon budget target they should set, they use their own costings and assumptions. Their analysis determines how billions upon billions, that's thousands and thousands of millions of pounds of taxpayer money, is spent. And I'm afraid it is deeply problematic. How do I know this? Because the cost of offshore wind used to prepare this carbon budget 7, was out by a factor of 3. The Climate Change Committee said offshore wind would cost £38 per megawatt hour, but contracts were being signed by their Secretary of State for £82 a megawatt hour. That suggested that something was clearly going very wrong on a key input for the exact target that we are voting upon today. So I wrote to the Climate Change Committee, I will make this point, I wrote to the Climate Change Committee asking them to look at this, and they sent me a dismissive reply. So I wrote about it in a newspaper. And what did they do? They reported me, a democratically elected politician under the Ipso Editor's Code, and tried to get me to remove my opinion. I did not. And just a few months later, the government updated its own costings, not to £80 a megawatt hour or £90 a megawatt hour, but to over £100 per megawatt hour. That's the minister's own figure. That means not only was I right, but that offshore wind was now predicted to cost triple of what the Climate Change Committee had said that it would. Now, I don't know which is worse, that we are making huge decisions on the basis of such poor analysis, or that nobody on that side of the House thinks this warrants any scrutiny, or that an unelected advisory body is using taxpayers' funds to try and silence elected representatives rather than focusing on getting their costings right. Everybody in this House should think that that is shameful. And if they were wrong by a factor of 3 on offshore wind, something we have better evidence for than pretty much anything else in the market, how can we trust any of the rest of the analysis? So let's look at some of their claims. They claim that a low-carbon electricity supply is cheaper per unit than high-carbon electricity. But if your numbers are out by a factor of 3, then maybe it would. They say that most businesses will not be affected by net zero, particularly in the services sector. How do they justify that? Let me tell the House, if net zero blocks the advance of AI in this country, that will have a catastrophic impact on our services sector. Here's another one. A reduction in meat and dairy will mean a healthier diet. Who are they to tell us what to eat and give nutritional advice? Claim after claim, sweeping statement after sweeping statement, with nobody holding them accountable. And yet this advice, this target, will affect almost every part of normal life. And for those who argue we need strict climate targets to provide certainty for jobs, that's what the Minister just said, that is nonsense. The country doing the best at creating clean tech jobs is China, which is now the world's largest polluter. And for those that say this is about our moral duty to fix climate change, I will remind them that every time a British factory shuts here, where we have some of the cleanest electricity in the world, and we import those same goods back from coal-powered China, we are not helping climate change, we are increasing global emissions. And before they get on their high horse, I will remind them, we are the only party to call for the measurement of the offshoring of emissions. They don't want to know because they don't care. And here's the problem. They don't want to properly measure if we're just trading emissions here for emissions abroad, because they don't really care whether this target is actually good for the worker or good for jobs or good for the cost of living or good for the environment. That's why none of them cared to actually read the impact assessment. I've taken so many interventions and none of them could give a figure. They didn't read it. They didn't read it before coming. I'll happily give way.
Of the impact assessment says the transition away from fossil fuels will lead to a net increase in job creation. I believe that she said a moment ago. I believe that she said a moment ago it doesn't mention at all the impact on jobs. I invite her to correct the record.
The analysis that he's pointing to refers to a Times modelling. That's what they use for the baseline. If you look at what the Times modelling says a few pages down, it says it specifically does not look at the impact of jobs on the overall energy transition. It is in there in black and white. And here's the thing. The honourable gentleman might try and desperately Google now that he's in the chamber, but the truth is none of them cared to actually read the impact assessment properly. They didn't read it. They didn't scrutinise it because none of them care. They're all here, let's be honest, they are all here to read their boilerplate speeches. They'll all be exactly the same to virtue signal how much of a good person that they are. And that's the truth, because most of those benches come from climate NGOs and green lobby groups. I'm afraid the Minister does too, and they care more about ideology than they do about evidence. And I would ask them this, how many of them actually had to turn a profit for a living? How many of them actually had to work out how to pay someone else's wages? How many of them had to manufacture something and consider all the costs that go into making and selling something in Britain? And the thing is, we could be doing this so differently. We are 1% of global emissions, 99% are happening elsewhere. And those countries, they are not persuaded by Britain driving itself into poverty, whilst the Secretary of State preaches at them from his pulpit. In fact, they are asking themselves why they should follow the path that Britain is taking when we are such an obvious example of what not to do. A country which is making its energy scarce and expensive, which is deindustrialising and impoverishing its own citizens. So what is the solution from here? First, we must reject decarbonisation by deindustrialisation. That's why we must measure the offshoring of emissions. Get rid of the unilateral carbon tax and stringent targets killing off British industry by repealing the Climate Change Act. They are voting today to increase the cost of aviation and shipping. I'll happily give way on that point.
I'm most grateful to the Shadow Minister give way. Given that we have reduced our carbon emissions by some 54% since 1990, perhaps the Shadow Minister agrees with me that we have led the way. We've done our bit. It's now time for others to do theirs.
Look, I thank the honourable gentleman for his question. The question is, can we protect the environment and protect the economy and protect living standards? Is what they are passing today going to help us do those things? I would argue it is not. Well, let's talk about it. They are voting today to increase the cost of aviation and shipping when our competitors in Asia, the Middle East and the US are not doing so. That is mad. So the second part of our plan, first, save British industry. Second, we have to make electricity cheap. Just 10% of our emissions are in the electricity system. The vast majority are in transport, industry and buildings. Our electricity is clean. Do they even realise that? It's some of the cleanest electricity in the world. The problem is that it's too expensive and it's deterring electrification. I'm not someone on the right who thinks that all clean tech is stupid, but I do think that cheap electricity and consumer choice should be king. Third, we should be wholeheartedly embracing innovation and exports of British clean tech, whether that's the next generation of nuclear or software or consumer products. And finally, we should pay much more heed to nature, something we were proud to do, but this government is much less keen on. Funnily enough, they are much more attracted to net zero than nature, perhaps because the former gives them unlimited powers to dictate to people what they can and cannot do, and to tax people who do things that they do not like. That is, after all, a socialist dream. But I would bet everything that our approach would be better for the British economy, and it would be better for the environment too. But what it means is wresting this agenda away from the incredibly well-funded vested interest green lobby groups, providing these figures that they all merrily cite without having actually read the reports. And frankly, they don't have the balls to do it. They don't even have the balls to take on their out-of-control Secretary of State. And so I'll end on this. The public keep being promised cheaper energy and more jobs. And yet those things are not materialising. And if people want to know why governments keep failing, they should look at this impact assessment, which I'm afraid is mumbo-jumbo, that doesn't tell the reader what the target will do to the cost of food or energy or the cost of business. And they should look at the fact that parliamentarians today are prepared to wave it through. Nobody asked a question of the minister. The minister actually didn't even take any questions because this is meant to be a debate where we scrutinise these important decisions, and she didn't want to answer any. And who in the public voted for this? Who in the public voted for more expensive food or energy bills or boilers? Who voted to increase our imports of goods from China? What this legislation does, let's be very clear, is it takes control away from ministers, and it gives it to civil servants and unaccountable bodies and activists who will tell ministers that they cannot prioritise the cost of living or the economy, even if they were elected to do so. Now, the Energy Secretary might not be in his post for much longer, but his legacy with this target will be to make us poorer and weaker. Ministers will be more bound by red tape and less able to deliver on their promises. But it doesn't have to be this way. This is the moment to take back control for their constituents, to say that ministers should not be bound by legislation waved through with no scrutiny, with ministers who won't take any questions, but they should be bound by the democratic promises they've made to the electorate. That's how we fix this. That's how we put our constituents back in the driving seat, and that's why they should vote to reject this legislation today.